welcome. My name is Megan De Dios, and I serve Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as Director of Continuing Education. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the 15th anniversary celebration of the School of Theology and Ministry. Happy birthday, STM. We are also thrilled to celebrate the book launch of Formative Theological Education, co-edited by Colleen Griffith and Hoffman Espino, and featuring 9 STM faculty authors. Woohoo! We have a very full program tonight, so we're going to get right to it. I would like to quickly thank our co-sponsors for this evening's event, the C21 Center, the Center for Ignatian Spirituality, the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies, the Roach Center for Catholic Education, and the Boston College Theology Department. I now have the pleasure of introducing Father Michael McCarthy. Father McCarthy is a Jesuit priest. He's currently in his second year serving the School of Theology and Ministry as Dean. Holding a PhD in Christianity and Judaism and Antiquity with an emphasis on patristic theology, Father McCarthy has held positions on the Religious Studies and Classics Department faculty of Santa Clara University, as well as being named Executive Director of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education. Most recently, he held the position of Vice President for Mission Integration and Planning at Fordham University, where he also held a faculty appointment in the Theology Department. Please join me in welcoming Father Michael McCarthy, Dean of the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry.
Thank you and good evening and welcome. Good evening to all of our friends and benefactors and alumni. Good evening to our colleagues from various parts of Boston College. We're thrilled to be in the presence of our provost, David Quigley. And good evening to the many good people who make the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry such a great place. Our amazing faculty, our wonderful administrative team, and perhaps most importantly, the terrific students that we have the immense privilege to be able to accompany at this significant moment of your lives. I'm just grateful, very grateful, that you have taken time in this very hectic time of year to join us for tonight's celebration. On this occasion, we salute Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, which is 15 years old. I myself am slightly older than that, but I am still relatively young in my role as the dean, and I'm grateful for the generosity of so many people who have enabled the STM to advance in its mission since 2008, which is to prepare leaders in lay and ordained ministry and for service rooted in faith in increasingly multicultural contexts. Before I arrived, the STM community articulated a set of 5 core values, which I'd like to share now. Not only do these 5 core values ground what we do, but our commitment to them shall guide our future long past these 15 years. Rooted in the Ignatian tradition, these values are inspired explicitly by the person, life, and vision of Jesus. The Boston College School of Theology and Ministry claims boldly that it will educate theological and ministerial leaders, 1, who will be formed for a variety of academic and ecclesial contexts and for faith-based service. 2, who will engage in scholarship, critical thinking, and practices of prayer and discernment. 3, who will forge collaborative communities of learning and of worship. 4, who will be immersed in the richness of the Catholic and Jesuit theological and spiritual traditions. And 5, who will celebrate and embody a commitment to inclusivity, a respect for difference, and who will engage diversity, including interreligious and ecumenical diversity. All that you can find on the STM website. The faculty and I are fully committed to these values, and on this occasion of our 15th anniversary, I have been reflecting more personally on how we embody these values today in our current context. And I would say this: fundamentally, we are a community rooted in an abiding faith in the compassion of God. We seek that compassion at all times. We are held accountable by it. And at a moment when the world is torn apart by war, mutual hostilities, corruption, environmental degradation, and profound injustice and falsehood, we regard the compassion of God as our source, our hope, our courage, and our joy. We are a school of theology and ministry in the Jesuit Catholic tradition. I know that sounds somewhat obvious. It is, after all, part of the name. But it's also a commitment, an identity, and a mission. In fact, our particular commitments are what really make us distinctive in the larger landscape of graduate theological education, both in the United States as well as throughout the world. We're a school of theology, and we are intentionally a school of theology, not a school of religious studies. And while we certainly benefit from a range of disciplines and methods, the disciplinary heart of our school is the study of theology, which in its root sense is the study of, talk about, reflection on, well, God. The very mystery of who God is does not deter us. Rather, it invites us to new intellectual and personal and communal depths of encounter with that divine mystery, and that changes our way of being in the world. We aim to form people for lives of ministry, and while we do understand ministry in the broad sense, the word itself suggests service in an ecclesial context. And that is central to our understanding of ourselves, our work, and our whole range of obligations. We are a Jesuit school. Now, that term Jesuit can mean many things to many people. It does mean many things to many people. Jesuit universities throughout the world frequently talk about Jesuit as their brand. At the STM, we understand the term Jesuit in a more literal sense as referring to a deep institutional connection to a particular religious community known as the Society of Jesus, a community that I happen to have spent the vast majority of my own life in, for which I am grateful beyond telling. In a very practical way, the Society of Jesus is a major benefactor of the STM. One of our key obligations is to form Jesuits throughout the world, and because the Society of Jesus itself understands its own mission to include the formation and education of men and women for lay, religious, and ordained ministries, we are deeply committed to that as well. And because the heart of the mission of the Society of Jesus is Jesus, he is at the center of who we are. In addition, we are aware that the brand Jesuit has come to suggest a distinctive culture that is rich, open, inquiring, collaborative, creative, and faithful, cultivating among a diverse set of people a sense of belonging, and desiring to reconcile fractures within our societies and within our souls. And finally, we are a Catholic school. Here too, Catholic means many things to many people. In the context of the STM, it communicates the school's commitment to a particular religious tradition and to form the next generation of leaders of it. We are not non-denominational, but in the 21st century, I cannot imagine how we would be Catholic without also being committed to promoting ecumenical and interreligious engagement for the good of the world. But we do so with love and affection and a critical eye from a particular place. We understand ourselves not only as part of Boston College, but also distinctively within Boston College to be a work of the Catholic Church. And at this particular moment of history, what a complex, mysterious, challenging, contentious, thrilling, sometimes painful, sometimes wonderful, always significant work it is. It is also a work that is entirely dependent not only on the goodwill and generosity of the people who make up the STM, but more centrally, it is dependent upon the grace of God. We take seriously the question posed by Pope Francis, who urges us to ask, where is the Holy Spirit leading the church? And to ask that in a spirit of discernment and freedom and humility and trust and love. And it is people such as are formed at the STM who help us understand, who will help us understand what that means, and who will lead the way into a future we cannot clearly see. And yet we are rooted in an abiding faith in the compassion of God, whose power can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. To ask, where is the Holy Spirit leading the church, is a profoundly different kind of question than asking, what agenda do we have for the church? Because it recognizes what Pope Francis has made clear. It is not his church, or an individual's church, or a group or party's church, but it is God's church. God, who called Abraham and Sarah to leave a place that was familiar and go to places they could not have imagined, who called St. Peter or Mary Magdalene to live lives they could never have foreseen. And for those of us who have the privilege of being part of such an enterprise, of promoting formative theological education, we're just so grateful. I know I speak for all my colleagues, all the members of the faculty, all the members of the administrative team, when I say how thankful we are for this opportunity to serve this amazing mission, and how grateful we are to be celebrating the past 15 years and looking forward to many, many years ahead, working for the greater glory of God. I am now very pleased to introduce two of my colleagues who have co-edited a recently published volume, which is really the centerpiece of tonight's celebration. Very appropriately, the volume is entitled Formative Theological Education. So would you please join me in welcoming Professors Colleen Griffith and Hofsman Ospina.
Thank you, Dean McCarthy, and thank you for your talent and vision and discerning ways that you bring to Boston College, and especially that you bring to the STM, particularly in the aftermath of the loss of a much beloved leader in Thomas Stegman. The stars sure lined up well when you came our way. and we're very grateful for your leadership at this time. Happy birthday, STM. We begin from a place of gratitude tonight. Thanks to all of you, students, alumni, and friends of the STM for coming. Thanks to the faculty authors who contributed to the project, and to the Provost's office that made it possible through a very generous grant, to the continuing education team, to Paulus Press for being here tonight and offering this book at a considerable discount. This has been a collaborative effort from the start. Hosman and I will begin by sharing a little bit about what led to the book and what it means for this text to be situated in a markedly changing theological landscape. We offer the book as two members of the BC community who know well and appreciate very much Boston College's long-standing commitment to formative education, something evidenced in its numerous innovative programs, its scholarship, and cross-campus initiatives. As Hosman and I started chatting about the potential of this project, we became convinced that the next step in Boston College's effort to underscore the formative would be for individual disciplines to wrestle with and articulate what this mission looked like in their respective areas of study. So we set out to provide a beginning articulation of what formative theological education could look like. Now, the School of Theology and Ministry was an obvious place for that kind of reflection to happen, largely because we are a school of theology, ministry, and faith-based service that has had to think in very practical terms about how and when theological insight is most persuasive, about where it rises from, and what it returns to on the ground, and what serves to foster impactful appropriation. In addition, the STM is very much accustomed to raising questions like, what kind of education is going to enable scholars and ministers and faith-based service leaders to move deftly in mission through changing seasons? It's notable, too, that the STM has always had a large religious education faculty of national and international repute, a group of women and men that thinks creatively about pedagogical strategies for transformation and has shown leadership in doing so for decades now. Yes, we are a place that has much to offer regarding a vision and an approach that theological educators might be able to lean into. Now, all along, we sensed that in a world as troubled as ours in this historical moment, educators could easily lose heart, wondering if what they do has any impact at all, given evidence of so much loss of a moral compass, dangerous polarization, so many people being duped into subscribing to profound untruths, disengagement, siloing. We hope that this book offers such educators a way of thinking about their work anew. And yes, thinking about it as having transformational potential and the possibility of substantive impact. And all of this reflection to which the book attests has been happening in what we recognize to be a very changing theological landscape.
Thank you, Colleen. Happy birthday, STM. I would never miss a quinceañera. There is no doubt that the Catholic theological educational landscape in the United States and throughout the world is changing, posing new questions, opportunities, and challenges. A new order of demographic, cultural, social, geopolitical, technological, educational, and religious dynamics is calling theological educators to assess how what we do is still relevant. Pope Francis, in the good company of philosophers, analysts, and other thinkers, reminds us frequently that we are witnessing the rise of a new way of understanding ourselves as human beings. This means that how we engage religious questions and interpret the richness of the Christian tradition will largely depend on the operative anthropology that drives our educational efforts. This may not seem novel, since doing that is inherent to theological education, yet we must be reminded of the task at hand. Most of the Catholic institutions dedicated to theological education, including universities, seminaries, secondary and primary schools, pastoral institutes, parishes, among others, were established at a historical time quite different from the one in which we are living today. While wrestling with the perennial questions of theology and human existence, they were established to meet the intellectual, spiritual, and pastoral needs of particular communities that sponsor them and the questions of the historical time in which they were established. The pedagogical models and practices that have characterized Catholic theological education for centuries, including non-interactive classroom lectures and long exercises of textual analysis, usually relying upon the idea of the instructor as the sole or main source of knowledge, with a strong deference to taken for granted authorities, has fulfilled an important role and served the needs of many students of theology. For centuries, theological education was synonymous of preparation of the clergy and other pastoral leaders in order to perform ministerial duties. A few members of the faithful found their way into programs that would prepare them academically to engage in theological scholarly inquiry. Today, our institutions of theological education, the pedagogies and educational practices that have traditionally identified them, and even the purposes for which they were established are under severe scrutiny in light of the emerging anthropological paradigms that are redefining our shared self-understanding. One thing is clear: we cannot educate theologically as if we were living in the 16th century, or the 19th century, or even the middle of the 20th century. In the 21st century, we need fresher approaches to theological education that are distinctly formative. From a Catholic perspective, to assert that theological education is formative is to envision this important task as an exercise that mediates the richness of the Christian tradition that we received as believers, while always remaining ready to respond to the questions and needs of God's people here and now. Therefore, formative theological education is deeply and must be deeply ecclesial, prophetic, contextual, imaginative, embodied, collaborative, en conjunto, expansive in its understanding of the complexity of the human experience, inclusive of voices, texts, and experiences of the baptized and others, with particular attention to those that have been marginalized, ignored, or forgotten. And it must be responsive to the needs and questions of humanity as we make meaning of our historical existence, honoring commonalities and differences. With this book, Formative Theological Education, we want to offer an entry point into these commitments. We want to inspire conversations that eventually lead to reimagining the spaces and pedagogies we use to educate theologically. Renew the minds and the hearts of those called to this important vocation. Discern the most urgent questions that theological educators need to address in our day. And assess with humility whether the purposes that have historically driven our institutional commitments to theological education are actually the purposes that will keep theological education institutions relevant today and tomorrow. Welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, Osman. So at this time, we'd like to introduce the faculty authors that are part of the book, and we've asked each to speak for 2.5 minutes, which is a great challenge to any theologian. And so we're going to begin with Professor Andrew Davis, who is a professor of Old Testament, who offers theological educators much insight into what a biblical understanding of knowing looks like. Andrew.
Right here. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Hoffman. Hello, everyone, and good evening. I believe that the best formative theological education is rooted in relationship. I believe that when students in the classroom feel like they are seen and known not just as empty vessels to receive knowledge, but as human beings who have complex lives outside the classroom also, and our ability to engage those complex lives outside the classroom is what will make it possible for the stuff that we do in the classroom to be transformative for their lives at large, and for the students to be able to integrate the material that we're covering in the classroom with their lives outside of the classroom and bear fruit later on when they graduate from our school. I think this kind of knowing and being known is what we see in the Old Testament, my field of study. And I think that the Old Testament itself is in many ways a book dedicated to formative theological education. And this process is rooted in the Old Testament in Israel, first of all, being known by God. That's the beginning of everything, that Israel understands itself to be known by God, and in their being known by God, they're invited to come to know that God themselves better. And this being known by God is an invitation to come to know their people's tradition of being known by God, and to bring that tradition to bear on their own time and place in history. And so I think as a School of Theology and Ministry, this is what the Old Testament offers, our own reflection on formative theological education and the way that the Old Testament can be a resource for what we do in the classroom for our students and our community at large. And with that, I yield my final 15 seconds to the gentleman from Systematic Theology.
Richard Lenan is professor of systematics, who knows well the self-implicating nature of the discipline of theology itself, and suggests formative ways of speaking when talking about God. Richard.
Thanks, Hosman. There are 3 interrelated points that are central to what makes theology theology. First is that it's decentering, that we're dealing with God who is not us and whom we never will master. The mystery of God that Mick referenced earlier. Secondly, even the language we have to talk about God comes not from us, but from the self-revelation of God. So we are always in a position of being receivers rather than initiators in terms of talking about God. And thirdly, that the language that we have is mediated to us through a community of faith. We don't get to make up our own language or our own God. So in those 3 ways, theology forms by first decentering. That might suggest that theology is always going to be something other than design your own adventure or set your goals and use theology to achieve them. So why do theology then? Well, because that God, that decentering God, offers us more than we can accomplish on our own. That the God whom we know in Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit in the community of faith is a God who invites us to possibilities that go beyond what we alone can imagine. And all of that makes theology both formative and transformative. And on our best days, even good, clean fun.
Thanks, Richard. Thomas Groom is a professor of theology and education. He draws attention to the epistemological shifts that occur when theological education aims to be formative and the pedagogical accents that ensue. Tom.
Thank you, Colleen. As a loquacious Irishman, 2.5 minutes. It takes me that long to say hello to people. I also rejoice at this beautiful screen that's here, marking our 15 years of its excellence, etc. But maybe at the break time, come up and take a look behind it at St. Patrick presenting the shamrock to the High King of Ireland to explain the Blessed Trinity to him, because it had 3 leaves and yet there was only 1 shamrock. So it's absolutely historically valid and believable, believe me. So when you're at the break time, if you haven't seen that image, come up and take a look at St. Patrick. I think all theological education should be formative. And I would say formative of a living faith. And by a living faith, I mean a faith that is alive, that is lived, and that is life-giving. A faith that is alive and vibrant and progressing and outgoing and growing and expanding and drawing upon that fresh water that he promised to the Samaritan woman, constantly evolving. A faith that is not only alive, but is also lived. Ultimately, this faith of ours has to get done, has to be lived. And then as life-giving for oneself and ultimately for the life of the world. Now pause for a moment, and I will warrant that everybody here, not just at our School of Theology and Ministry, but in other parts and pieces of your life as well, that you have experienced formative theological education. In many ways, you would not be here this evening if you had not. So just pause for a moment and ask yourself, from your own experience, what's the key? What's the clue? What's most needed for education in theology to be formative? What does that require? For a moment, reflect and recognize your own wisdom. Now, I'd love to call on everybody, but we'd never get to the reception. I would say there's many keys and clues to what makes for formative theological education. But in my own career across the years, almost 50 here now, at Boston College, my focus has been on pedagogy. Because I do think, to use an inelegant phrase, it is where the rubber hits the road in how we teach it. What we teach, who we teach, where we teach, why we teach, all terribly important. But ultimately, how we go about it, I think, is imperative to attend to and to be very intentional about. And I would summarize in many ways that our approach, our pedagogy, has to be participatory. It has to deeply engage the learners in their own discernments, in their own recognitions, in coming to embrace and make their own wisdom for life, etc. It has to be participatory, and they have to become agents of their own knowing, rather than simply dependents or recipients or whatever. And I'm going to load the dice at this point and say that I think we have an extraordinary pedagogy and a model of good pedagogy in Jesus of Nazareth. Now, libraries of books have been written about what he taught, but comparatively little has been written about how he taught. And I would say that Montessori, John Dewey, Paulo Freire, Brooke, you name it, in many ways echoed some of the basic principles that we see reflected in the pedagogy of Jesus. And we see it especially in the Synoptics, but in John's Gospel as well. And as I read the scriptures and look for his pedagogy, he's constantly engaging people to stop and think about and look at their own lives in the world. The reign of God is like people sorting fish. The reign of God is like a woman baking bread. The reign of God is like, or whatever. Turning people to what Freire would call their own realidad and beginning to get them to stop and look, but then very often turning that reality upside down and questioning their whole perspective. And so the Samaritan is the neighbor, and the prodigal is welcomed home, and Lazarus goes home to God. Getting people to think, to look at their life, but to think about it very differently. And in the midst of that, to proclaim. his gospel, which is from the beginning of Mark's gospel, said he did with authority. So it wasn't as if he was just simply a discussion leader, but he was deeply engaging of people's lives, and then indeed had a powerful teaching into the midst of those lives, but then constantly waited and encouraged people to come to see for themselves, to hear for themselves. Blessed those who have the eyes to see and those who have the ears to hear. And obviously he meant more than just physical sight or hearing. They wanted people to recognize, to come to see for themselves. What Lonergan might say, making it their own and making decisions out of it. And he did this constantly throughout his public ministry, but I see it even in one verse. It's Matthew chapter 6, verse 26, I recall. It's also in Luke's gospel. And you could imagine people saying to him or asking him, Jesus, is our God provident? And Jesus could easily say, yes, our God is provident. Or he could easily stand up and say, today I'm going to give you a talk about how provident our God is. And instead he says to them, look at the birds of the air. Now I can imagine him out in the fields and getting people to look up at the little birds that were flying around. He said, take a look at those birds of the air. And then a reflection upon it. They neither reap nor sow, nor gather into barns. And then the moment of instruction. And yet, your heavenly Father feeds them. And then, instead of saying, and that's the answer, he wants them to see for themselves. He says, aren't you more important than many sparrows? I think we could learn a lot, not only from what he taught, but from how he taught as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Melissa Kelly is a professor of pastoral care and counseling. She underscores the formative power of a theological education that fosters resilience.
Good evening, everyone. I've learned it's safest if I stick with my notes. So, quick show of hands, if I might. How many of us would say today has been such a smooth, such an easy day that there's been no need to cope with anything? There's been no stress of any sort today. Anyone? John? John Baldwin. Okay. Let me pose another question. How many of us perhaps have lost track of how many stressors we've had to cope with today? It's been one, yeah, lots of hands. And how many of us might say we're somewhere in between? Yeah. Although by 5:30 this morning, I had coped with quite a lot already. But the point is, we cope continuously. We have no choice but to cope with life constantly because life continues to throw stressors at us. We cannot cope successfully unless we have a reserve of resilience. And so I am very interested in resilience, and in this chapter, I am trying to explore through the lenses of neuroscience, social science, and pastoral theology how formative theological education can help us to cultivate and sustain resilience, particularly for our students, but for all of us. And I will just highlight that two ways that I think we do that are by a clear emphasis on hopeful meaning making and by forming communities that are mutually supportive. And those happen to be two primary means that we know through quite a lot of research for fostering resilience, meaning making and community. And finally, I would say I feel convicted that for the Christian, the most hopeful road to resilience goes straight through Christian faith and life. And I think institutionally, we have an incredible opportunity and a responsibility to be intentional in helping our students and ourselves foster and sustain resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. We're going to catch up next with John Baldwin, but I'm mindful that you've been sitting for a little bit. And without leaving your spot, would you just stand for a moment and give yourself a stretch? And perhaps have a quick check-in with the person next to you. Maybe introduce yourself if you don't know that person. What did you hear so far that piques your interest? John Baldwin is a professor of historical and liturgical theology. He calls for the fostering of communities that pray and celebrate together as integral to any vision of formative theological education? John.
Thanks, Colleen. I did write mine out word for word because I was in terror of the organizers and their requirement that we do 2.5 minutes, so I'm trying to be obedient. I'm sure that there's no need here with this audience to convince you all of the importance of liturgy for theological formation and ministerial formation. I myself have been privileged to spend almost the last 40 years teaching ministerial students. And during that time, I've noticed in the whole range of students I've taught a profound interest in the church's worship. What I want to emphasize in these just couple of minutes that I have allotted to me is that we form students here both through liturgy and for liturgy. What do I mean? First, the biggest factor in theological formation with regard to liturgy is the experience of liturgy itself, the experience itself. I warrant that we're probably more influenced by what we see, hear, smell, and feel during liturgical celebrations than by the academic study of liturgy in the classroom. That's why it's so important that we here at the STM pay a lot of attention, a good deal of attention, to how we celebrate, especially at our weekly Thursday celebrations, which I wish all of you could come. We try, insofar as we're able, to help students to experience as well as to appreciate different cultural and musical styles within our own Catholic tradition. Our manner of celebration should ideally help us all to understand how the liturgy is where the rubber meets the road. Dr. Groom and I both use the same image. Where the rubber meets the road with regard to the theology that we're doing, not only in the classroom and in the library, but also in our pastoral activities. So that's number one, through the liturgy. Second, we are, after all, a school, an academic institution, and ministerial students need serious intellectual reflection on what it is that we do when we celebrate. I can't emphasize enough how eye-opening the study of liturgy is for so many of our students. Nor can I tell you how many times I've heard students say, "Why hasn't anyone ever told us all of this?" You're also no doubt well aware that liturgy is a sensitive topic for Catholics. That's an underestimation, huh? A sensitive topic for Catholics, especially since the reform of the Catholic liturgy has had its ups and downs, its successes, and its shortcomings over the past 60 years. We're coming up to the 60th anniversary of the Liturgy Constitution. That's why it's so important that in our theological formation for worship, that we do our best to be attentive to the signs of the times, to our own engagement with our cultures that celebrate, and at the same time remain solidly faithful to our rich Catholic tradition. We owe our students no less.
Thank you, John. Teresa O'Keefe is a professor of religious education and youth and young adult faith, and she asks what the role of good mentors is in this way of doing theological education, and what constitutes a good mentor. Teresa.
Thank you, Hosman. Thank you, everyone. It's great to see you all here. I will attempt to stay within my 2.5 minutes, as my colleagues have made the effort. So we have established that theological education is transformative. I argue that it is actually relationships that aid in that transformation. And within my chapter, I discuss in many ways how theological educators themselves can serve as models and mentors, and to what effect. And I name in particular 2 different kinds of moments. The first moment, considering the age of disaffiliation, where so many people are unfamiliar with actual religious belief and belonging and wonder why anyone would do that anyway, the theological educator serves as a model, or can serve as a model, of why this matters for anything. And so offers a way of framing theological education and belief and belonging in a way that makes meaning of one's life and purpose in the world. And in part, as doing so, they do it best when they actually offer themselves in some way to that, by an example of their own lives, if they themselves are believers, is what value it exhibits in their life and what membership or affiliation offers to them. That's one moment. Another moment in this age of division and choosing sides and staying in those sides, there is a time where someone may be a believer, but they may believe that their way of believing is the only way to believe. And so in that second moment, the theological educator plays a very important role if they can show in an even-handed way the valid diversity of theological perspectives within a tradition, while at the same time demonstrating how they themselves may select from that valid diversity to inform their own perspective. So that's it. Read the book.
Thanks, Teresa. Khalid Keefe Perry is a professor of public theology. He also directs our contextual education program at the school. And he addresses a very infrequently spoken about component, the essential role of imagination in any theological education that's going to be formative.
Thanks. Central to my work in general and for our consideration of formative education is a challenge to this phrase you may have heard called a failure of imagination. At its core, this phrase suggests that individuals or societies or churches sometimes lack the creative capacity to envision different futures or possibilities. However, I'd like to challenge the notion and argue that what we often label as a failure of imagination is, in reality, just the acceptance of a dominant imagination. A prevailing narrative that dictates how things are and how they ought to be. This dominant imagination is powerful. It is the voice that tells us that the status quo is immutable, that certain things are too deeply entrenched to be altered, and that our dreams of a different world are naive. But just because a particular narrative is dominant doesn't make it the only one. It simply means it's the loudest or the most accepted one at a given time. Why is this idea so crucial, especially in the realm of formative theological education? For me, I think it's because theology at its heart is about exploring our understanding of the divine, the universe, and our place within it. It's about asking profound questions, seeking deeper truths, and serving God's children, striving for a connection with something greater than ourselves, for the common good. I think often of something Francis said in a 2015 speech in Florence. He said, quote, "Christian doctrine is not a closed system, incapable of raising questions, doubts, and inquiries, but is living, is able to be unsettled, and is able to enliven. The church is not exhausted in the countless plans to change her structures. Instead, it means we are to be implanted and rooted in Christ, allowing herself to be led by the Spirit. If our theological pursuits are constrained by a singular dominant imagination, we risk missing out on the vast expanse of spiritual understanding and insight available to us as Spirit invites us to see new signs of the time, to discern where God is calling us in the church in this day. For our students, that means realizing the power that our imagination has, both to limit us and to let us peer into the greater freedom we might yet live into. Such an education doesn't just produce followers of Christ, it also cultivates faithful leaders, thinkers, and visionaries. It acknowledges that our understanding of the divine is ever evolving and that each generation has the opportunity and the responsibility to contribute to that deepening alignment with God's compassionate reign as led by the Spirit of God.
Thank you, Khaled. Well, and what about you, Colleen? What question did you bring to the matter of formative theological education? What have you come to see?
Okay, Hosman, but you're up next. I wrote my essay aware that the language, formative education, signals so many things today that it risks becoming diffuse. I sought to bring together three strong elements one finds underneath that large umbrella that theological educators in particular would recognize as being very congruent with a Christian understanding of the person, of the world, and the necessity of community. And so I highlighted an approach that cares for the fullness and uniqueness of persons, that tilts toward the practical relevance of learning, and that cultivates inclusive communities of belonging. And in doing this, it became apparent to me that while the language of formative education is of recent vintage, there are in fact really substantive insights from the Christian spiritual tradition that provide us with retroductive warrants for much of what gets said today about formative education. Rich spiritual traditions that deepen our grasp of today's descriptors. For example, the Ignatian and Jesuit tradition brings keen sensitivity to the whole person, offering robust reflection on what cura personalis entails. The Salesian way, hearkening back to Francis de Sales and Jane de Chantal, highlights that knowledge of God must be exercised very practically in the world, urging both affective and effective transformation in concrete, specific circumstances. And then the Benedictine tradition recognizes the power of community as its own school of love, advocating for a firmly rooted practice of hospitality that makes for an open door, yes, an open heart, and an open mind, too. My hope is that study of these and other such spiritual traditions within a Christian ambit will continue to inform and deepen theological educators' grasp of central elements of formative education, as they're talked about today. Doing so in ways that will generate energy and instill hope. You're up. Okay, Hausman, you're up. You're not off the hook at all here. So tell folks about the passion, the element in formative education that you're most passionate about.
Thank you, Colleen. I want to go back to one of the points that has been highlighted tonight on a regular basis, and that is the question of relationality. I am firmly convinced that formative theological education needs to be, must be relational. It's not enough to say, I care about the student or I care about the community. We must enter in relationship with our student and with the communities that we serve and where we teach. Theological education is an opportunity, being formative, in which to study how the I am of God meets the I am of the human person or individual. We know that the I am of God has been revealed throughout history, particularly in Jesus Christ. Yet, many times in the process of theological education, we pay little attention to the I am of the student, the I am of the person who is in the congregation, the I am the person we encounter in this particular experience. That I am is someone who is gendered. It is someone who is part of a race, is part of a context, is part of a socio-economic experience, is someone who is part of a culture. If we truly believe that theological education is and must be formative, we need to find and make the time and create the spaces to meet and go deeper into that I am of the individuals and all the persons that we encounter in the educational process. Thank you.
Okay, well, we've had 9 statements, and cumulatively, we hope they point in the direction of a very particular educational vision. So let's check in for about a minute and a half, 2 minutes with the person next to us. And what did you hear that sparked your interest? What would you like to continue chatting with one of these folks that spoke tonight when we get to that reception? Let's have just a minute or 2 for a conversation. So, there's a lot of energetic conversation out there. Our group is a bit too big to take comments from the floor tonight, but isn't it an absolutely great thing to be here in person at this juncture and celebrating this birthday with a full Gasson Hall? It feels terrific. So if you have a specific comment or question for one of our authors will be at the reception across the way. Feel free to pick up in conversation with them, and please stay in conversation with one another as well. But first, we have a special guest tonight with us, a leader who has been unwavering in consistent commitment to the formative as central to Boston College's educational mission. A profound orator, a man with a lot of vision, and a great friend to the School of Theology and Ministry. And our dean will introduce him now.
Well, first, thanks Colleen and Hossman for really leading us in a wonderful evening. But my job now is, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our special guest. Dr. David Quigley has served as Provost and Dean of Faculties at Boston College since 2014, a professor of history with a specialization in the urban and political history of the 19th century United States. Dr. Quigley previously served as the Dean of the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences between 2008 and 2014, and he has had the pleasure, the distinct pleasure, of working alongside the School of Theology and Ministry's 4 deans. So please welcome our Provost, David Quigley.
Very kind of you, Mick and Colleen, and again, congratulations on this wonderful moment in the history of the school, of the university writ large, and a wonderful volume that I received a copy of a week ago. Hoffman and Colleen dropped it off, and I congratulate all the faculty who contributed to this. I'll return to the topic of formative education in a few moments, but on behalf of University President Father Leahy and admirers across campus and far beyond, it is great to be with you here to mark this signal occasion. I woke up in the pre-dawn hours and set out for a walk from my home just west of Harvard Square to campus today, so I don't usually turn onto Mason, but I made a special point, the sun wasn't up yet, of going past the old home for at least some members of the STM community and making my way across. Came across the Charles River just as I would say it was the best sunrise of the year. If you were up this morning in those early morning hours, it was spectacular. And made my way past Assembly Hall as I made my way scrambling to get to Mick and the Council of Deans very early this morning. And it gave me an opportunity to reflect on those 4.5 or so miles that connect the history of the STM, its current state, and its hopeful future, and to reflect on my own journey as faculty member, administrator, and partner with so many of you around this room on supporting the good work of the School of Theology and Ministry. So first, let me begin by pointing to the various ways in which I see the accomplishments coming out of the faculty, students, and staff in STM as standing at the heart of who we are at BC, who we aspire to be, how we're to be of service to the local community and to the global church. That Council of Deans meeting that I referenced this morning, we had one of the more robust and I think engaging discussions in all my years, going on 16 years at that table, focused on a recent essay in America Magazine by the Cardinal of Chicago, Blaise Supich, about the Jesuit Catholic University as it currently stands and his hopes for the work that we do at places like BC going forward. And as I went through that, preparing for the conversation, hearing from colleagues like Mick and the other 8 deans at the table, some of the key words that bounced around the last few minutes, questions of renewal, thinking about transcendence, the ways in which the work that we're doing touches on the imagination, in community, in relationship. Certain key words played out in really powerful ways. Certainly the underlying question of what is the formative project, how do we do it differently and with particular power and intensity and moral foundation here came up. But one of the phrases that came up, and I actually threw it back to the deans, partly knowing that I was going to be speaking later today to this group, was towards the end, Cardinal Supich makes an interesting linkage before getting to the resounding closing on the theme of hope, which I think is so important, and if anything, we're celebrating STM as a source of deep, powerful adult hope for all of us as we need it at this moment. There's a turn to renewal fused in and connected to awareness. I use hope, imagination, renewal in a lot of my talks, a lot of my writing. That kind of focus on awareness that Cardinal Supich emphasized was something that we kicked around quite a bit and that I've been mulling in the month or so since I first read Cardinal Supich's letter. And I think this is where STM, both for the local Boston College community, for folks like me still learning and 26 years on into my BC education, and for colleagues around the Boston area, around the U.S. church, and globally, the ways in which working on formative theological education, working in the various subspecialties that our faculty and students are kind of exploring the horizons of on a semester by semester basis. You are doing the essential work of fusing the renewal of our institutions and of our faith with a deep and life-giving, generative awareness of all the sources that we can draw on and the new possibilities that our imagination opens up for us. Again, this 15th anniversary, great to have a moment of hopeful celebration in a particularly dark October for us in so many ways, locally, nationally, and certainly globally. Thinking back to 2008, at the end of a rough decade for Catholicism in the greater Boston area, a challenging moment for the U.S. on the world stage, STM arriving here on the Brighton campus just as the world economy was going into free fall. I stepped into the world of academic administration that fall, had the great good grace of becoming a new dean with Dick Clifford, and across these last 16 years, it's been one of the graces of my career to partner with and learn from the 4 deans, as was mentioned, Dick and Mark and Tom and now Mick. It's been a wonderful education for me, and over that time, much more than at the personal level, it's been an enriching engagement for the larger university as one thinks about how does Boston College live out its ambition to be a leader in Jesuit Catholic education worldwide. As you think of our most recent strategic plan, so many of the core elements of who we stand as, who we hope to be for the higher education community, for the church, for the larger society, come back to fundamental elements of what the STM contributes to our community. One of those most centrally is service to the local, national, and global church. We see it represented in the individuals and the larger community gathered here in Gasson this afternoon. But I would also point to the way in which, in terms of formative education, a commitment to formation not just for undergraduate or graduate students, but for faculty, for staff, for alumni, for the larger BC family, Father McCarthy has been particularly eloquent on this, but our hopes, our dreams, our aspirations in terms of formative education very much are enlivened by, expanded by the work that is done in projects like the volume that we're celebrating this afternoon. A few years ago, when we launched initiatives in formative education out of the Provost's office, we put out a first call for proposals for research. I'm thrilled to see the many ways in which faculty across campus took to that to really think, as Colleen and Hausman pointed out earlier, what are we going to learn from the dozens of disciplines represented around campus? I can't point to a more fruitful project and conversation than that which Hausman and Colleen led over these last few years. It's a wonderful accident of history that the volume is arriving just here at this 15th anniversary. But as we think about what we've already accomplished, but much more, as Cardinal Cupich demands, what we have before us, what we need to do, how we need to think about renewing our curriculum, how we have to push on the frontiers of all the work we do as teachers, as scholars, as mentors, as folks in service to communities near and far. This volume and this commitment to formation, I think, is absolutely essential. Let me close here because I'm very much looking forward to the more personal, relational conversation about this volume and the themes that we're celebrating this evening now as we go forward. But let me say that so much of this evening is about the broader project of formation and education at BC. For me, and I think for so many of Mick's fellow deans and others around campus, it has been essential over these last 15 years to have the School of Theology and Ministry here at this great national Jesuit Catholic research university. It's been an essential part of my own education as academic administrator, and I think not just personally, but for so many that I've seen around campus, we've been formed, we've been transformed by the engagement with the School of Theology and Ministry, faculty, students, and staff. For that, I am not just congratulating and celebrating, but thanking Mick and all of you from the heart of the university in the Provost's office and in academic affairs, and very much celebrating all that we've done together over these last 15 years. So I look forward to the cake and the celebration next door, and let me turn it back to Dean McCarthy at this point.
Thank you, David, not only for your presence among us tonight as we celebrate 15 years, but really for your own vision and leadership, and certainly for your support of the School of Theology and Ministry, and your willingness to understand, as very few provosts would do, to understand what it is that we do and who we are. And I'm personally grateful for your own vision for Boston College's distinctive commitment to formative education. And so it's great to have you recognize the way that the STM can contribute to that, specifically with our formative theological education. So thank you very much, David, for being with us. I also want to go back to our real organizers here, Colleen and Hofsman, for your own leadership and vision, not only in having the idea for the volume and then organizing everybody. That's not an easy thing to do, I know, but then organizing this event, which has been really remarkable. I'm grateful very much for your own vision and for your own passion and your dedication to the STM, and really to all of the faculty authors. First of all, I'm a little amazed that we all kept to 2.5 minutes, right? And we are actually right on time. I do not know that maybe I was a skeptic, but it is great that we have done it, but also not just the pith of what each of the faculty authors spoke, but you really manifested yourself as wonderful pedagogues, even in these few minutes that you had. And so I come away from this evening with a great sense of respect for you as colleagues, as not just scholars, but pedagogues, really. And I feel somewhat envious for our students who have the pleasure of meeting with you all the time. Let's also thank the many people who prepared for tonight, the team in continuing education, Megan de Dios, Cara Sullivan back there, and James Burriston, and other members of the planning committee, Sheila Folks, Anthony Russo, and Maura Caleri, all the graduate assistants back there, and everyone else from the administrative team, really thank you very, very much. As I have said, and I've indicated, really the great pleasure of being Dean of the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry is really working with so many wonderful people, with terrific faculty, with terrific members of the administrative team, and of course our students. And you are the ones that make this vision, this goal, this mission that we have, you turn it into an embodied reality. So for that, I am very, very grateful, and I now have the pleasure of inviting everyone across the hall to a sumptuous reception and a very fine cake. If you've never had a Boston College cake, they are really good. It's not just your flat white cake. This is really good cake, so which is worthy of a 15th anniversary. So once more, thank you, Colleen and Hofsman. Thank the faculty authors. Thank everybody, and thank you for being here.